Okay, today's lesson is going to build off of our last lesson, which was converting between fractions and percents. Today we're going to add decimals into that mix. So we will be converting fractions to percents to decimals and every which way from there. This is following our Big Ideas Math Green textbook, Chapter 5, Section 6. So instead of trying to draw this and write this live in front of you, I did just snap a picture of some notes that I like to take on fractions, decimals, and percents, and I call this kind of our conversion triangle. So last lesson, we really focused on this side over here, converting from percents to fractions, and we take our percent, we make it a fraction over 100, and then we simplified. Or if we were going the other way, we took that simplified fraction, we multiplied it up to get it over 100, and then we knew that was our fraction. And we're still going to use a lot of that today because that over 100 fraction is very important to converting between these different forms. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time focusing on this right side of the triangle because we've already gone over that, but I am going to be discussing the bottom from fraction to decimal, and then on the left between decimals and percents. So at the end of our last lesson, we talked about fractions that don't make that over 100 fraction very nicely. So, and I believe in the last lesson, we looked at the fraction 3/8 because 8 doesn't go into 100. So we talked about how you could multiply by 100 and then divide by your original denominator. Here's another way you can do it. You can, starting with your fraction, so I'm starting right here in this corner, okay? We would take that fraction and you're going to divide the numerator divided by the denominator. So it's num divided by den, just kind of some shorthand. When you type that into your calculator, that's going to take you to your decimal form. Now, not many students expect to see the decimal 88/100ths when they do 22 divided by 25, but that is in fact what it would be. Now, here's where we get this tie between fraction form and decimal form, because I'm going to do it in green so it sticks out. This decimal and this fraction that I've circled in green, you say them the exact same way. Okay, so we would say this is 88/100ths, and we read this fraction as 88/100ths. Now, this works every time. What might change is in our last video, so I'm going to write it out for you up here in the corner, we had 3/8, and if I do 3 divided by 8, that's going to give me the decimal 375 thousandths, okay? And if I wanted to take this to fraction form, I could start it as 375 thousandths, because that's exactly how I say the decimal is how I write that fraction. But we know that to make it a percent, we'd have to get it over 100. So that's the process we are working through right now. I know that I can divide both of these by 10, and I would end up, that's 37.5%, because it's 37.5 over 100. Okay, so recap. Last week we talked about the right side, making it over 100. I just talked about going from fraction to decimal, and you can take that fraction and you divide the top divided by the bottom, or more mathematically said, numerator divided by denominator. Okay, and then that decimal is very similar to our fraction over 100, or similar. Like I said, this one up here we got over 1,000, but we can then use that as almost a shortcut back and forth. Now, last but not least, we have the left side here in blue from decimal to percent or percent to decimal. Now, if I want to start at decimal and then go to percent, I'm going to follow my arrows here. I can see that I take my decimal, my 88/100ths, and I multiply it by 100, and then that gives me the percent. Now, since we're going the opposite direction, if I want to start at percent and go to decimal, I'm just going to take my percent, I'm going to divide it by 100, that gives me the decimal, okay? So we have a little note over here as well that when you multiply or divide the decimal, okay, when you multiply or divide either decimals or percents, your decimal is going to move 2 spots. Now, whether it moves to the left or to the right, that depends. If you are going from decimal to percent, that decimal point is going to move to the right. If I'm going from percent to decimal, that decimal is going to go to the left. Okay, and you'll kind of develop an understanding of that as things progress. So I'm going to clear out the ink to make this page a little bit easier to read and recap. If I'm starting at percent and I want to go to a fraction, I take my percent, I put it over 100, and then I simplify that fraction. If I want to go from fraction to decimal, which is a one-way street, I can't go from decimal straight to simplified fraction, but from fraction to decimal, I'm going to divide my numerator by my denominator. The way back to your fraction is to take your decimal, and how we say our decimal gives us this kind of in-between fraction of either over 100 or over tenths or over 1,000ths, depending on what your decimal is. And last but not least, when we want to go between decimals and percents, you are going to, if you decimal to percent, you multiply by 100, percent to decimal, you divide by 100. So let's do some practice. Let's see if we can make sense of all this. Okay, so for our next couple problems, I've set up a chart for us to talk about simplified fractions, fractions over 100, decimals, and percentages. So we're just going to kind of work our way from the top down. So in our first problem, we know that it is 48%. All right, and you can hop around and do this chart in any way. I tend to like to go from 48% to my 48 over 100. Because we know that 48% means 48 over 100. Now that I know 48 over 100, the proper way of saying that fraction would be 48 hundredths. So I can go right to my decimal form. These two are said the same way. And last but not least, I need to simplify. I know that I can divide 48 and 100 both by 4, so that might be where I start. 48 divided by 4 is 12. 100 divided by 4 is 25. I'm not going to be able to simplify that any further. That is my simplified fraction. Let's try the next one. This time we're starting with the simplified fraction. I still like to try to get to this over 100 first. I find it's very helpful if you can find that right away. So I'm going to take this fraction, I'm going to multiply it by 4/4, because 25 times 4 makes 100, which is my goal. 8 times 4 makes 32. So if I know if it's 32 over 100, I know it is 32%. And I know that this fraction is read as 32 hundredths. Now, I could go to my calculator and I could type it in as 32 divided by 100, but we read them the same way, so I'm just going to go with that. Last one on this page, we're starting with the decimal this time. So I read this decimal as 96 100ths, so I can go right to that 100 form. That tells me this is 96%. Since it's 96 over 100, it's 96%. And again, I know I can divide both of these by 4, so we'll start with that. 96 divided by 4 is 24, and 100 divided by 4 is 25. I cannot simplify that any further. Let's go look at the next grouping of problems. So for these 3 kind of sets of problems, I would like you to pause the video now and try to solve them. I'm going to pause the video as well and fill in some answers, so if you don't pause now, the answers are going to all of a sudden pop up. Alright, so please compare your answers to mine and let's see how you did. I made a little mistake and made it kind of easy for you. That first row of problems was one of the same problems on the last one. You may or may not have realized that. But hopefully the next two challenged you a little bit because we're going to move on to some other types of fractions, decimals, and percent problems. So the last topic I want to talk about today is when we get percentages that have decimals in them. And how can we take those percentages that have decimals and make them fractions? And this kind of goes along with how we talked in the last video about fractions that don't have denominators that go nicely into 100. So you can approach this two different ways. Now, the first misconception I see students is they see a percent like 24 and 0.8%, and they go, well, it's a decimal, it's got a decimal. And it's totally correct, but as long as it has that percent sign, remember it is always being compared to 100. So what we mean by 24 and 0.8% is we mean 24 and 0.8 over 100. Because of that percent sign, we have to then take it to the over 100. Now, decimals are okay in a percent. We don't like them so much in a fraction. So our next step is to get rid of or somehow get a different form in this number. So the strategy we like to use is if you only have one decimal, I'm actually going to multiply both of these by 10 because kind of a pattern we can see in math is when I multiply in 10 or by 10, that decimal moves over a place because we're kind of adding in another place value. So if I multiply 24 and 0.8 over 100 times 10 over 10, that would give me 248 1,000ths. From here is where I can actually simplify now that I have this completely in fraction form. I could divide both of these. I might start off with dividing by 4 and both of those by 4. Actually, you know what? For some simpler math, I'm going to divide by 2 because I can do that in my mind, or mental math wise, easier. So 248 divided by 2 would give me 124. 1,000 divided by 2 would give me 500. These are still both even, so I know I can divide by 2 again. So 124 divided by 2 would be 62. 500 divided by 2 is 250. Now they're still both even. So I'm going to divide by 2 halves, or 2 over 2 again. That would give me 31 over 125. And I know that 31 is a prime number, so these cannot be simplified any further. So that was doing the fraction form first. So taking that percent, putting it right over 100, and working from there. What some other students like to do is they tend to like to make it a decimal first. So on the other side here, let's make this into a decimal first. And I know that to go from a percent to a decimal, I'm going to divide by 100, or kind of consider moving that decimal point to the left. That means my decimal form would look like this. From here, I know I read this decimal as 248 1,000ths. Okay, and now you'll notice that this is the same as right here. We'd go through that simplifying process, and we could simplify that down, and this time I might smartly, kind of intelligently go, oh, I can divide this by 8. And hey, what do you know? 248 divided by 8 is 31, and 1,000 divided by 8 is 125. Okay, so there wasn't a big difference between these two, but sometimes students like to start with that decimal, and sometimes students like to start with that fraction. So if you have a decimal in a percent, you need to either multiply it by 10 or sometimes 100, kind of as needed, or take that percent, divide it by 100 to get your fraction form, then go to your fraction, or your decimal form, go to your fraction form, and simplify from there. We don't have a lot of problems like these, but it is a good skill to have. I'm going to end the video here. Don't be afraid to go back and look at those notes I showed earlier to kind of help remind you how to go from one to the other.